Picture 1996. You push through heavy glass doors into a sudden blast of cold air conditioning, stepping onto a blue and yellow carpet that smells faintly of industrial cleaner and artificial popcorn. You walk straight past the brightly colored candy racks and head directly for the perimeter walls. You scan the new releases section, desperately searching for the specific cardboard box art of the Blockbuster movie everyone was talking about all week at school or work. Friday night was never a passive experience that simply happened to you on a living room couch. It was a distinct physical destination. It was a structured event. The video rental store functioned as a brightly lit, localized third space where your entire neighborhood inevitably crossed paths right around 6 in the evening. The stakes were entirely tangible. If the hollow plastic cases sitting directly behind the main display box were already gone, you entirely missed out. You were forced to quickly pivot. To understand why this mattered, you have to look at the sheer, clumsy weight of a plastic VHS cassette. This physical object was massive, fragile, and fundamentally bound to a single geographic location. The store could only stock maybe 30 physical copies of a massive summer hit. Once the high school kids and the early commuters grabbed them off the racks, the shelves were just empty. This entirely manufactured scarcity actively forced a secondary action. You had to physically wander the narrow interior aisles. You suddenly found yourself staring at the horror section, picking up a dusty horror movie based entirely on a lurid, painted illustration on the front cover. You compromised heavily with your siblings standing in the comedy aisle, negotiating over who actually got to hold the plastic case on the dark car ride home. Choosing a film required a tangible, physical investment of your time, your physical effort, and intense group negotiation. You proudly paid your $3.90 at the cluttered front counter, and you truly owned that specific artistic choice for exactly 48 hours. You did not simply turn the television off after 10 minutes if the plot was slightly boring. You sat down and you watched the entire thing, because returning early to the busy neighborhood store meant another long drive, another financial transaction, and another completely agonizing decision process. The heavy, inherent friction of the bulky magnetic tape format created a completely captive audience. It gave even terrible low-budget movies a genuine fighting chance to be fully seen and remembered. We openly embraced the strict boundaries of the local store inventory. We willingly allowed the bored high school kids standing behind the register to recommend something weird and entirely unexpected. The physical building was not just a simple distribution center. It was a mandatory, localized curation engine. It forcefully made you look at physical things you never would have explicitly searched for on your own. But this entire ecosystem depended on a physical limitation we were quietly desperate to eliminate. The shift began with a small, highly reflective silver disc. In the late 90s, the digital versatile disc quietly entered the consumer market, fundamentally changing the logistical reality of media distribution. The heavy, mechanical VHS tape required complex internal spools, fragile magnetic ribbons, and the physical act of rewinding. The DVD eliminated all of that mechanical friction. It was light, incredibly cheap to manufacture in massive bulk, and completely immune to the magnetic degradation that plagued tape rentals. This technological leap dramatically lowered the barrier to entry for shipping. You could not practically mail a heavy VHS tape across the country without incurring massive postage costs and severe risk of damage. A DVD, however, could slip seamlessly into a standard paper envelope and travel through the existing automated postal infrastructure for pennies. This optical format laid the invisible groundwork for the destruction of the physical storefront. However, the technology itself did not kill the neighborhood store. The brick-and-mortar giants readily adapted to the silver disc. They simply replaced the bulky plastic clamshells with slightly thinner plastic cases. The bright blue and yellow aisles remained heavily trafficked. The massive corporate franchises, led primarily by Blockbuster Video, seemed entirely invincible, aggressively expanding their geographic footprint and systematically buying out the independent mom and pop operations. They possessed massive inventory advantages and exclusive studio distribution deals that seemingly locked in their perpetual dominance. The late fee wasn't just a minor penalty, it was the structural foundation of the entire industry. By the early 2000s, the dominant corporate video rental chains were generating roughly $800 million a year strictly from late fees. This accounted for a staggering 16% of their overall corporate revenue. It was essentially pure, unadulterated profit. The entire business model slowly mutated from renting entertainment into aggressively policing returning schedules. The massive chains financially penalized their absolute best, most frequent customers. If you rented 3 movies for the weekend and forgot to return them by noon on Monday, the compounding fines quickly exceeded the actual purchase price of the physical discs. The physical third space, once a vibrant community hub for cinematic discovery, transformed into an anxiety-inducing chore. More customers actively resented the very transaction they were participating in. The corporate giants were structurally addicted to this incredibly toxic revenue stream. They could not abandon the punitive late fee without instantly collapsing their quarterly earnings reports. They had built a massive, sprawling empire entirely reliant on the inevitable, minor mistakes of their own consumer base. This created a massive, glaring vulnerability. A small startup named Netflix recognized that the DVD format allowed for remote delivery, but their true innovation was entirely psychological. They introduced a subscription model that explicitly promised 0 due dates and absolutely 0 late fees. You paid a flat monthly rate, they mailed you the reflective silver discs in iconic red paper envelopes, and you kept them for as long as you desired. When you finally mailed one back, they automatically sent the next title in your digital queue. They weaponized the customer's deepest, most visceral resentment against the established corporate giants. They did not just offer the convenience of mail delivery. They offered total emotional absolution. You no longer had to frantically rush to the strip mall at midnight to drop a plastic case into a metal slot. The anxiety of the ticking clock was completely eradicated. But the real killer of the neighborhood video store wasn't the post office. It was the store's own toxic financial engine. The legacy chains found themselves completely paralyzed by their own massive success. To compete with the mail-order subscription model, they would have to completely dismantle their highly profitable late fee infrastructure, because they would have to willingly surrender hundreds of millions of dollars in guaranteed annual revenue. They hesitated. They attempted confusing, half-measured hybrid models that only alienated their customer base further. They stubbornly clung to the physical storefronts, the expensive commercial real estate leases, and the massive overhead costs of paying thousands of retail employees. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the shifting landscape. They believed they were strictly in the business of physical video rental. They failed to realize that the consumer was actually purchasing access to entertainment, and the physical disc was merely the temporary delivery vehicle. The red envelopes flooded the suburban mailboxes. The brightly lit stores slowly began to feel archaic, heavily burdened by their own rigid rules and punitive financial structures. The localized ritual of the Friday night visit was being steadily replaced by a continuous, low-friction pipeline of mailed media. The magic of browsing the aisles was quietly traded for the clinical efficiency of managing a digital queue on a desktop computer. The transition was remarkably swift. The foundational assumption that you had to physically travel to acquire a movie was permanently broken. The neighborhood store had inadvertently trained its entire customer base to actively hate the rental process, leaving the door wide open for a system that promised endless entertainment without the looming threat of a financial penalty. It was a monumental shift in consumer behavior, permanently altering how we consumed art, and leaving the sprawling brick buildings to slowly decay into empty, forgotten husks of retail history. The final blow did not arrive in a red envelope. It arrived through a coaxial cable. For the first 50 years of home entertainment, the movie was a physical object. It was heavy magnetic tape. It was a reflective plastic disc. It required manufacturing, warehousing, and complex global shipping logistics. It demanded a massive network of climate-controlled retail spaces and thousands of minimum wage employees just to hand it to you across a laminated counter. Then, the object simply evaporated. It became invisible data packets traveling at the speed of light. In the late 2000s, residential broadband speeds finally crossed a critical threshold. The internet transformed from a text-based research tool into a massive pipeline capable of sustaining high-definition video. The friction of the physical world was entirely bypassed. This fundamentally destroyed the core economic equation of the video rental industry. Look at the pure financial reality of the brick-and-mortar model. A physical Blockbuster store carried roughly 10,000 individual discs. To maintain that inventory, they paid thousands of dollars every month in commercial real estate leases. They paid utility bills to keep the massive blue and yellow signs glowing. They paid employees to meticulously restock shelves and rewind return tapes. The entire financial architecture rested on the assumption that renting a single movie was worth $4. By 2011, the basic math of a Friday night had inverted completely, and Netflix transitioned from a mail-order DVD service into a streaming giant. They entirely untethered the media from the medium. You were no longer paying for the logistical cost of moving a physical object from a warehouse to a storefront to your living room. You were paying strictly for server access. The perceived economic value of an individual film instantly dropped to zero. Why drive 3 miles to pay $4 for a single rental when $8 bought you the entire archive from your couch? The answer was brutally simple: you did not. The American consumer aggressively abandoned the physical storefront. The massive corporate chains went into a catastrophic financial death spiral. They attempted to launch their own digital streaming platforms, but they were hopelessly tethered to their expensive physical infrastructure. They were hemorrhaging cash on thousands of empty, cavernous retail locations, while their nimble digital competitors operated strictly out of cheap server farms. In 2004, Blockbuster Video commanded nearly 9,000 retail stores globally. They generated $6 billion in annual revenue. They were an absolute cultural monolith. Just 6 years later, they filed for bankruptcy. It was one of the fastest, most violently complete corporate collapses in modern economic history. The speed of the transition was terrifying. We did not slowly phase out the neighborhood video store over the course of a generation. We turned off the open signs and locked the glass doors practically overnight. The liquidation sales were grim. The once vibrant community hubs were reduced to selling off their yellow metal shelving units for scrap. They sold off the scuffed plastic movie cases for 50 cents apiece. The local infrastructure of the Friday night ritual was systematically dismantled and sold to the highest bidder. Empty storefronts blighted strip malls across the entire country, lingering for years as Spirit Halloween pop-ups or discount mattress showrooms. We witnessed the total vaporization of a multi-billion-dollar industry. It wasn't just that the primary delivery mechanism changed. The fundamental nature of the transaction was permanently altered. The video store sold a specific product for a finite window of time. The streaming service sold a perpetual, never-ending subscription to an infinite library. The physical building simply could not compete with the sheer volume and aggressive pricing of the digital void. The physical constraints of reality were successfully eliminated entirely. The movie was no longer a heavy object you held. It was a temporary stream of invisible light projected onto your television screen. The massive logistical chain of global physical distribution was completely flattened into an automated monthly credit card charge. The massive blue and yellow signs flickered out. The industrial carpets were violently ripped up from the concrete floors. The glowing drop boxes were hauled away to landfills. The era of the physical media rental ended forever. It left absolutely nothing behind but an empty commercial footprint. It forced a radical shift in how we valued our leisure time and weekend entertainment. The Friday night event was digitized. The active hunt was replaced by a passive delivery. The neighborhood died. You sit heavily on the couch and scroll aimlessly through an endless grid of perfectly sized digital thumbnails. You press the down button on your remote for 40 straight minutes, completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of algorithmic choices. You finally select a movie you only half want to watch, secretly regretting the arbitrary decision before the opening credits even finish rolling across the glass. The Friday night ritual of physical curation is completely dead. We deliberately dismantled a vibrant, localized third space where neighbors routinely crossed paths and passionately debated the artistic merits of a cheap comedy over a laminated counter. The neighborhood video store imposed incredibly necessary physical constraints on our collective weekend leisure time. If the massive summer Blockbuster was entirely rented out, you were forcefully pushed into the obscure, forgotten aisles. You had to compromise with your siblings. You had to actively participate in the collective hunt. What we lost wasn't just the smell of carpet and plastic cases. We completely lost the communal friction that fundamentally made the final selection feel authentically earned. When you had to drive 3 miles to acquire a physical piece of media, you were deeply invested in its ultimate outcome. We traded the physical weight of a decision for the numb paralysis of infinite options. When you have absolute access to every single movie ever formally produced, nothing ever feels remotely urgent. We permanently replace the intentional, active hunt for a highly specific film with a passive, algorithmic feed designed strictly for perpetual, quiet engagement. The artificial scarcity of the physical store actually protected us directly from our own creeping apathy. It directly gave our evening entertainment a distinct, highly measurable value. The sprawling brick buildings are permanently gone. The massive neon signs are permanently dark. But thoroughly understanding exactly why they existed and what aggressively replaced them reveals a profound cultural truth about modern technological convenience. We did not simply upgrade our video delivery mechanism just to save a few quick dollars every single month. We willingly and blindly surrendered the shared, fundamentally human physical event of choosing narrative art together, opting heavily instead to merely consume endless digital content entirely alone in the cold, isolated glow of a flat television screen late tonight.